For the king, not for the man I loved. Those were the words waiting on Noah Ellis's desk when King Adrian Whitmore opened the door to the eastern chamber. Not a scream. Not a curse. Not even a tear-stained accusation. Just 7 quiet words written in Noah's careful hand, folded beneath the small paper crown he had made months ago during one of Adrian's sleepless nights. Outside the palace windows, Eldoria was still celebrating. Bells rolled across the capital like thunder. Thousands of voices filled the streets below, chanting Adrian's name because he had survived the council, secured the throne, and proven to every noble house that the Whitmore crown would not break. Gold banners snapped in the winter wind. Fireworks bloomed over the city in pale blue and silver. The kingdom believed its king had won everything. Adrian stood in Noah's doorway with real gold heavy on his head and realized, with a coldness that reached deeper than the snow, that he had come home to nothing. The room was too clean. That was the first thing that frightened him. Noah was never careless, but he was alive in every space he touched. There was usually a cup of orange blossom tea cooling near the window, a book left open face down on the chair, a pair of soft gray gloves drying by the hearth because Noah always forgot how cold palace stone could be. Tonight the chair was empty. The hearth was swept. The bed had been made with such perfect corners it looked untouched, like a guest room prepared for someone who would never arrive. Adrian stepped inside slowly, the hem of his coronation cloak dragging over the floor. Snow melted from his boots and left dark marks on the pale rug Noah had chosen because it reminded him of clouds before rain. The scent was gone too. That was what finally made Adrian's breath tighten. Noah's scent had always been gentle, pear and white tea, soft enough to hide beneath palace perfume but steady enough to calm him after hours of smiling for enemies. Now there was only lavender soap, cold linen, and the faint metallic trace of the key lying on the desk. A silver key. The key to this room. The key Adrian had given him with a careless sentence. Stay close. It is safer. He remembered Noah looking down at it like it was a promise. Adrian had let him believe that. His gloved hand hovered over the letter, but he did not pick it up yet. Some part of him, the proud and foolish part still wearing the crown, thought that if he delayed reading it, the truth might delay becoming real. Then his eyes moved to the window. It was open by 1 inch. Not wide enough for escape. Just enough to let winter in. Just enough to erase the last warmth Noah had left behind. On the sill sat a chipped blue teacup, turned upside down to dry, because Noah hated leaving water spots on porcelain. Adrian stared at it longer than he should have. He remembered the way Noah would hold cups with both hands, even in summer, as if he was borrowing warmth from the world. He remembered telling him once that kings did not have time for small comforts. Noah had smiled and said, "Then maybe men do." A sound rose from the corridor behind him. His captain of the guard, Mason Reed, stopped at the threshold and went silent. No one in the palace spoke unless Adrian allowed it. Tonight the silence felt like judgment. Adrian finally lifted the letter. The paper was light. Too light for something that seemed to pull the whole room out from under him. His thumb brushed over Noah's handwriting, neat and small, the kind of writing that belonged to someone who had learned not to take up too much space. From outside, another cheer rose from the city. Long live the king! Adrian closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, the words sounded like a punishment. Adrian did not read the letter in the doorway. Pride made him fold it once, then again, as if neat edges could hold back panic. Find out when he left, he said, and even to his own ears, his voice sounded too calm. Mason Reed bowed, but his eyes moved across the empty room with the careful sadness of a man who already knew the answer would hurt. Yes, Your Majesty. The title landed badly. Adrian looked at the paper crown on the desk, small and crooked, made from the corner of an old council report. Noah had laughed when he made it. Adrian remembered that laugh because it had surprised him, soft and bright, in the private library at nearly 2 a.m, when the rest of the palace had been asleep and Adrian had been pretending he did not need anyone. Noah had been different then, or maybe Adrian had simply not understood what he was looking at. The memory came without permission. 3 years earlier, before Noah had a room in the eastern wing, before nobles learned to lower their voices when he passed, he was just a gardener's son with dirt on his cuffs and sun on his brown hair. Adrian had found him in the royal greenhouse during a state dinner he had escaped from for exactly 7 minutes of quiet. Noah was kneeling between rows of winter herbs, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tying a snap stem to a thin wooden stake with blue thread. He looked up and startled so badly he dropped the spool. "Your Highness," he said, scrambling to stand. His face went pink with embarrassment, and he tried to hide his muddy hands behind his back. Adrian should have turned away. A prince did not make conversation with staff after midnight, especially not an Omega whose scent, even softened by rain and soil, carried a fragile warmth that made the room feel less empty. But the greenhouse smelled like basil, damp earth, and something sweet cooling on the table. "You are trespassing," Adrian said. Noah glanced around at the plants, then back at him, uncertain. "I live here more than most of them do." The answer was so honest that Adrian nearly smiled. Nearly. Noah seemed to realize what he had said and lowered his eyes at once. "I am sorry. My father tends the north gardens. I was only fixing the feverfew before it froze." Adrian remembered the blue thread trembling between Noah's fingers. He remembered, too, the small paper packet Noah pushed toward him a few minutes later. "For headaches," Noah whispered. "You keep touching your temple." No one else had noticed. In the ballroom, dukes had praised his strength, generals had measured his usefulness, and counselors had watched for weakness. This quiet boy in muddy boots had seen pain. Adrian had taken the packet without thanking him. He had been raised to accept service as naturally as breathing. Still, the next morning, the tea on his desk tasted faintly of honey and mint, and his headache faded before noon. For weeks after that, little things began appearing where he needed them most. A fresh handkerchief before difficult meetings. A cup of orange blossom tea beside reports from the border. A slice of honey cake wrapped in brown paper, left under a note that read, "Kings should eat even when they are pretending not to be hungry." Adrian never asked who left them. Noah never admitted it. That was how their first kindnesses began, hidden in plain sight, small enough to deny and large enough to become necessary. Back in the empty room, Adrian opened his fist and saw that he had crushed the folded letter against his palm. A sound came from the hall, hurried footsteps, then Mason's voice speaking low to someone. Adrian turned. An older housekeeper stood outside, wringing her apron between both hands. Mrs. Clara had served the Eastern Wing since Adrian was a child, and she had never once looked afraid of him. Tonight she did. "Your Majesty," she said softly. "Before he left, Mr. Ellis asked me to give you something only if you came looking for him yourself." Adrian's throat tightened. "What?" Mrs. Clara reached into her pocket and placed a small glass vial on the desk. Inside was a dried sprig of feverfew tied with faded blue thread. Tucked beneath the ribbon was a note so small Adrian almost missed it, written in Noah's careful hand. "This was the first thing I gave you. I suppose it should be the last." The vial looked harmless in Adrian's hand, no larger than his thumb, but the blue thread around the feverfew pulled him backward so sharply he had to grip the edge of the desk. He remembered the night it became more than tea, more than quiet notes, more than a gardener's son noticing what a palace tried to hide. It had been late October, the first freeze of the season, and the council had kept Adrian in a windowless chamber for 6 straight hours after a failed border negotiation. By the time he escaped to the Eastern Library, his collar felt too tight and every candle seemed too bright. He had dismissed his guards with a single look, but the pressure in his chest stayed. A king was supposed to be made of stone. Adrian had learned that before he learned to ride a horse. Stone did not shake. Stone did not need anyone. Then Noah slipped through the side door carrying a tray with one hand and holding a book against his chest with the other. He stopped when he saw Adrian standing in the dark between the shelves. "I thought you would still be with the council," Noah said. His voice was careful, but not frightened. That was one of the first things Adrian had noticed about him. Noah was nervous around power, but not around pain. "Leave it," Adrian said. It came out colder than he meant. Noah glanced at the untouched fireplace, the scattered papers on the floor, the way Adrian's fingers were pressed against the carved wood of the reading table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Instead of obeying, he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The library suddenly felt smaller. Warm ember light touched the side of Noah's face. A loose strand of hair clung to his cheek, damp from the snow beginning outside. "You have not eaten since breakfast," Noah said softly. Adrian turned his head. "Have you been counting my meals?" The question should have embarrassed him. Instead, Noah lifted his chin just a little, cheeks pink but eyes steady. "Someone has to." For a moment, the room held its breath. Adrian could have laughed. He could have punished the familiarity. He did neither. He watched Noah cross the narrow space between the shelves and set the tray down. Honey cake. Mint tea. A small bowl of soup still steaming. Ordinary things, almost foolishly gentle in a palace built on treaties and polished threats. "You should not speak to me that way in public," Adrian said. Noah's fingers paused on the cup. "I know. They will use it against you." Noah looked at him then, and there was something in his expression Adrian did not have a name for. Not fear. Not hope. Something softer and more dangerous. "Is that why you only sound kind when no one else can hear you?" The words landed between them like a match dropped on paper. Adrian looked away first. He hated that. He hated that this quiet Omega with ink on his sleeve and snow in his hair could make him feel seen without asking permission. "You misunderstand," Adrian said. "My position requires distance." Noah nodded slowly, but the hurt crossed his face before he could hide it. "Of course. Distance." He reached for the tray as if to leave, and Adrian moved before thinking. His hand closed gently around Noah's wrist, not hard, not commanding, just enough to stop him. The contact was brief, warm through the thin fabric of Noah's sleeve, and both of them went still. Adrian released him at once. "The south corridor is unsafe tonight," he said, his voice lower. "Take the inner passage. Mason will be there." Noah stared at him, confusion flickering through the pain. "You arranged that?" Adrian picked up a report he was not reading. "I arranged many things." It was the closest he came to admitting protection. Noah left through the hidden door 5 minutes later, carrying an empty cup and a misunderstanding Adrian was too proud to correct. But before he disappeared, Adrian saw him touch his wrist where the king's hand had been, as if the warmth had stayed. In the empty chamber years later, Adrian stared at the faded blue thread and understood with a sickness that spread slowly through him. Noah had remembered every small kindness. Adrian had hidden every one of them so well that, in the end, they had looked like nothing at all. And if Noah had left the feverfew as a goodbye, then Adrian had been saying goodbye to him for years without knowing it. Adrian kept the vial on Noah's desk, but he could not make himself step away from it. The feverfew, the blue thread, the old memory of Noah's wrist beneath his fingers, all of it pressed against the present until the empty room seemed to breathe around him. Mrs. Clara stood by the door, pretending not to watch the king fall apart in slow, silent inches. She had the mercy not to speak first. Adrian wished she would. Orders were easier than questions. "How long did he plan this?" he asked at last. Mrs. Clara looked down at her apron. "Long enough to leave clean sheets for whoever took the room after him." Adrian's jaw tightened. That sounded exactly like Noah. Heartbroken enough to disappear, considerate enough to make sure no one else had extra work. It was almost funny, in the cruelest possible way. Adrian let out one quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had not hurt so much. "He always did apologize to furniture when he bumped into it." Mrs. Clara's mouth trembled, just barely. "He said chairs had a difficult life in a palace." The small memory landed softly, then broke open. Adrian saw Noah in the breakfast room, half asleep, scolding a chair under his breath after striking his knee on it, then looking horrified when he realized the king had heard. Adrian had not smiled then. He had turned his face toward the windows so no one would see. He had hidden even that. Mrs. Clara reached into the pocket of her apron again and drew out a folded square of cream-colored cloth. "There is something else." Adrian recognized it before she unfolded it. One of his formal gloves. White silk, used for ceremonies, torn weeks ago on the gold clasp of his sword belt. He had thrown it aside after a council meeting, irritated by a dozen things that had not been Noah's fault. Now the glove lay in Mrs. Clara's hands, perfectly mended with stitches so small they were almost invisible. Inside the cuff, Noah had sewn a tiny mark in pale blue thread. Not initials. Not a claim. A single little star. Adrian touched it with one finger. Why would he fix this? Because you needed it for tonight. The coronation. The celebration. The public victory Noah had prepared him for, even while preparing to leave. Adrian looked down at his own hands. He had worn the matching glove while nobles kissed his ring and praised his sacrifice. He had stood beneath chandeliers with a crown on his head, never knowing the person who mended his dignity had already chosen the door. The memory changed without warning, pulling Adrian into the evening before the coronation, when Noah had stood in the West Gallery with a silver tray held carefully in both hands. It had been a small diplomatic reception, nothing grand enough for history books, only ambassadors, council families, and people who smiled as if teeth were a form of currency. Noah had been asked to serve tea because Mrs. Clara trusted his steady hands. He wore a simple gray uniform and kept his eyes lowered, but Adrian had seen the way the candlelight caught the soft brown of his hair. Lord Halden had seen it too. "Careful, Your Majesty," Halden had said lightly, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "A king should not grow too fond of his little habit." A few nobles laughed. Not loudly. That would have been vulgar. They laughed softly, politely, in the way powerful people made cruelty look like manners. Noah's hand tightened around the teapot. Only for a second. The tea did not spill. Adrian's fingers closed around his glass until the stem gave a faint warning creak. He could have spoken. One sentence would have been enough. He could have said Noah's name with honor in front of everyone. Instead, he looked toward the ambassadors and chose silence because the alliance was fragile, because the vote was tomorrow, because every eye in the room was waiting for the king to prove he could not be moved by an omega with gentle hands. Later that night, Adrian signed Halden's nephew away to a distant trade post and ordered Mason to keep certain guests out of the eastern wing. It was protection. It was punishment. It was also too late. Because Noah had not seen the order. He had only heard the laughter. A sound came from the hallway, quick and uncertain. Mason returned, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his uniform. "Your Majesty." Adrian knew before he spoke that the news was bad. Mason's eyes flicked once toward Mrs. Clara, then back. "The North Gate has no record of Mr. Ellis leaving. Neither does the servants' road." "Then check the stables." "We did." Mason swallowed. "One old carriage is missing from the greenhouse path." Mrs. Clara closed her eyes. Adrian turned very slowly toward the window. The greenhouse path. The place where Noah had first found him, or maybe where Adrian had first been found. "Who drove it?" he asked. Mason hesitated just long enough to make the room colder. "No one, sir. The horse was returned at dawn by a fishing family near Greyhaven Harbor. They said the carriage was empty." Adrian's hand closed around the mended glove. Greyhaven was almost 30 miles from the Palace, a coastal town where ships left before sunrise and names changed for the price of a ticket. For the first time that night, fear became sharper than regret. Noah had not been careless. He had simply left one road open for the man, not the king. Greyhaven Harbor should have been just another name on a map, a small fishing town 30 miles east of the palace where fog rolled in before breakfast and people measured time by tides instead of bells. But when Mason said it, Adrian remembered Noah once mentioning it over soup in the library, so quietly that Adrian had almost missed it. "My mother wanted to open a tea shop there," Noah had said, stirring honey into Adrian's cup even though Adrian always claimed he did not like sweet things. "She said the sea made people honest." Adrian had looked up from his reports. "Did she?" Noah smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "No. She got sick before we saved enough. Then my father stayed because the palace paid steady wages and hospital bills did not care about dreams." At the time, Adrian had said something practical about royal pensions. It was what a prince was trained to say. Clean. Responsible. Useless. He had not asked what Noah had lost. Now, standing in the emptied room, Adrian saw the pieces he had ignored because they were not part of a treaty. The chipped blue cup. The mended glove. The feverfew tied with old thread. Noah had been leaving a trail of his life in plain sight, and Adrian had treated it like background music. Mrs. Clara moved to the bedside table and opened the lower drawer. "He asked me to burn these," she said. "I did not." Inside was a neat stack of unsent envelopes, all addressed to no one. Adrian knew he had no right to touch them. He touched them anyway, because kings were rarely taught how to be honorable when they were afraid. The first envelope held a grocery list written in Noah's hand: flour, pears, black tea, thread, cough drops for Mrs. Clara, peppermint candy for Mason because he looks angry when hungry. Mason, standing by the door, stared at the floor as if the carpet had suddenly become fascinating. Mrs. Clara gave a watery little sniff. "He always bought the peppermint himself. Said guards should have one harmless weakness." Adrian turned to the next page. This one was not a list. It was a memory, written like a confession. "My father used to wait outside the greenhouse every night until I finished closing the vents. He would say, 'A person who waits for you is a kind of home.' I think that is why I waited for Adrian for so long." The room blurred at the edges. Adrian lowered the page. He could not bear how ordinary the pain was. Not grand. Not royal. Just a boy who had lost both parents, who had learned to love through practical things: warm tea, repaired gloves, medicine measured carefully, a door left unlocked for someone too proud to knock. Adrian thought of his own mother then, a queen who had kissed his forehead once before leaving for a political retreat and never returning to the palace as his mother again. She had chosen safety, or duty, or escape. No one ever explained it to him clearly. They only taught him that wanting someone to stay was childish. So he became a man who never asked. He simply arranged corridors, guards, punishments, pensions, gifts. He mistook protection for tenderness and silence for strength. "He did not think I would come," Adrian said. The words came out rough. Mrs. Clara looked at him with the gentle cruelty of someone who loved Noah enough to tell the truth. "No, Your Majesty. I think he hoped you would." That was the part that hurt him most. Mason shifted in the doorway. "There is more." Adrian looked up. Mason held a narrow strip of paper, damp from snow, stamped with the harbor office seal. Greyhaven reported one passenger boarding the morning ferry under the name Alice Gray. Destination unknown. Adrian reached for it, but his hand stopped halfway. Alice Gray. Noah had taken his mother's dream and turned it into a hiding place. Then Mason added, very quietly, "The clerk remembered him because he paid for 2 cups of tea and only drank one." The second cup of tea haunted Adrian more than the ferry ticket. It was such a Noah thing to do, buying warmth for someone who was not there, leaving space across from him even while he ran. Adrian pictured him at the harbor counter before sunrise. Hood drawn low, hands wrapped around a paper cup, steam fogging his lashes while fishermen argued about weather and freight. Noah would have chosen the corner seat. He always did. Corners made him feel safe. And there, with the sea only a few yards away and the palace 30 miles behind him, he had still paid for 2. Who was the other cup for? Adrian asked, though the answer had already settled in his chest like winter. Mason did not soften it. The clerk said he looked at the empty chair for nearly 10 minutes. Mrs. Clara covered her mouth. Adrian turned away, because if he looked at either of them, he might become less than a king in front of witnesses. The city outside was still cheering. That was the cruelty of palaces. Somewhere beyond the glass, people were dancing beneath blue lanterns, eating sugared almonds, telling their children they had lived to see a strong king keep his crown. Inside, Adrian could not breathe around the thought of an empty chair in Greyhaven. Then the door opened without permission. Lady Victoria Ashford stepped into the room with 2 council aides behind her, wrapped in a white fur cloak and court diamonds that caught the candlelight like ice. She paused only briefly at the sight of Noah's empty shelves. "So it is true," she said. Her voice was calm, almost kind, which made it worse. The attendant left. Adrian's hand closed around the fairy notice. This room is private. Nothing attached to the throne is private tonight. Victoria glanced at the desk, the mended glove, the little paper crown, and understood too much too quickly. She had been raised in courts. She knew how to read what people tried to hide. The council is already asking questions. By morning, the city will be asking them too. Mason stepped forward. Adrian lifted one hand, stopping him. Let them ask. You cannot afford that. For a second, Victoria looked almost tired, like someone who had also been trained to become useful before becoming happy. They will say he left because you kept a common Omega too close. They will say he fled after being dismissed. They will say whatever gives them power over you. Adrian looked at her then. And what will you say? For the first time, Victoria looked away. It was only a second, but it was enough. I will say what protects the Alliance. The words were correct. Perfectly trained. Adrian had spoken that language all his life. He hated hearing it now. Noah had heard something like it too, only earlier, in the winter garden behind the chapel, when Victoria found him standing beside the closed fountain with his sleeves pulled over his hands. She had not come to threaten him. That was what made it worse. I do not hate you, Mr. Ellis, she had said, looking at the frozen roses instead of his face. That is what makes this crueler. If I did, this would be easier. Noah had gone very still. Victoria's voice stayed gentle, but every word carried the weight of training. The council will not let him keep both you and the throne. They will turn you into proof that he is ruled by private weakness. If he refuses the engagement, they will use your name until the kingdom hears nothing else. Noah had looked toward the eastern windows, where Adrian's study glowed with lamplight. Does he know you are telling me this? Victoria had answered honestly. No. For a moment, they stood there like two people trapped on opposite sides of the same locked door. Then Victoria said, almost too softly to hear, I am sorry. Noah gave a small nod, the kind a person gives when politeness is the last thing holding them together. So am I. One of the aides cleared his throat and placed a folded newspaper proof on the desk. The headline was not official yet, but the ink was dark enough to feel permanent. Royal favorite vanishes after coronation. Below it, a smaller line suggested scandal, instability, weakness. Noah reduced to rumor before the snow had even melted from the carriage wheels. A second proof waited beneath it, harsher than the first. Council questions King's judgment after Private Omega disappears. Mrs. Clara made a small wounded sound. Adrian picked up the proof and read it once. Then again. His face did not move. That frightened Mason more than anger would have. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice. Announce the engagement tonight. Stand beside me on the balcony. Smile. Let them believe the story has no teeth. Adrian stared at the headline. He thought of Noah in the greenhouse, cheeks pink with embarrassment, telling a chair it should watch where it was going. He thought of the empty cup across from him in Greyhaven. He thought of every time Noah had waited for him to become brave enough to be honest. No, Adrian said. The word was quiet, but it changed the air. Victoria's eyes sharpened. Adrian. It was the first time she had used his name without a title. If you refuse now, they will make him the reason your reign begins in doubt. Adrian folded the newspaper proof slowly and set it beside the paper crown. Then they have chosen the wrong reason. At the doorway, Mason's posture shifted. Mrs. Clara lowered her hand from her mouth. Victoria looked at him as if she was seeing not the king the council had crowned, but the man Noah had been waiting for. Before she could answer, bells in the distance stopped all at once. The celebration outside fell into a strange, spreading hush. Mason turned toward the corridor, listening. Footsteps rushed closer. A young guard appeared, breathless, snow on his boots. Your Majesty, he said, voice shaking. There is a rumor at the harbor. Someone recognized Mr. Ellis. And now agents loyal to the opposition houses are already asking questions at the harbor. Adrian did not run. Kings were trained not to run. Not in halls full of watching servants, not under portraits of ancestors who had mistaken stillness for strength. But he moved so quickly that Mason had to lengthen his stride to keep up. Behind them, Lady Victoria followed in silence, her white cloak sweeping over the marble like frost. The young guard's report spread through the corridor before Adrian reached the war room. Opposition agents. Harbor rumors. Noah's name, or the name he was trying to hide inside, passed from mouth to mouth like a match touched to dry paper. At the long council table, Lord Haldan was already waiting with 3 ministers and a face arranged into concern. Adrian had seen that expression since childhood. It meant someone was about to ask for cruelty and call it wisdom. Your Majesty, Haldan began. The situation is delicate. Adrian stopped at the head of the table. He did not sit. The crown still pressed into his hair, heavy enough to ache. Say what you mean. Haldan folded his hands. The Omega must be contained before our rivals reach him. The room went quiet in a way that made every candle seem louder. Mason's jaw tightened. Mrs. Clara had not followed them, but Adrian suddenly wished she had, wished someone who loved Noah plainly could stand in a room where everyone else loved power and polite voices. Contained, Adrian repeated. Haldan did not flinch. Protected, of course. Returned quietly. Questioned privately. The public must never believe he left of his own will. Adrian looked at the map spread across the table. Greyhaven Harbor was marked with a brass pin. 30 miles. A ferry route drawn in blue ink. A small town, a cold pier, an empty chair, 2 cups of tea. And what story would you prefer? Adrian asked. That he was confused. Overcome by attention. Perhaps manipulated by hostile houses. Haldan's voice softened, almost fatherly. It is kinder than letting people think your Majesty was abandoned on coronation night. There it was. Not Noah's safety. Not Noah's choice. Adrian's embarrassment. The old lesson returned with perfect clarity. Keep the crown polished, even if the hands beneath it are shaking. For one breath, Adrian saw himself doing what he had always done. Let Mason bring Noah back. Let Victoria stand beside him on the balcony. Let the papers be corrected. Let the palace swallow the truth until it became another closed door. He did not know that, hours earlier, Noah had stood outside Adrian's study with one hand raised to knock. In his room, Noah had packed almost nothing. The old coat his father wore in the greenhouse. His mother's tea recipes, folded into oil paper. A single coin Adrian had once handed him to buy honey cakes from the winter market, back when Adrian had pretended he wanted them for the guards. Noah left the jewels in their velvet boxes. He left the silk robes folded on the chair. Gifts from a king belonged in a palace. The coat, the recipes, and the coin belonged to the life he still hoped was his own. He had walked to Adrian's door because some foolish, faithful part of him wanted one last reason to stay. Then he heard Lord Haldan's voice inside. The engagement must be announced before dawn. The Omega cannot remain a question. Noah's hand lowered. He stood there for 3 breaths, close enough to touch the door, far enough to understand he was already outside Adrian's world. Then he turned away without knocking. In the war room, Adrian's gaze dropped to his own hand. He was still holding the mended glove. The tiny blue star Noah had sewn inside the cuff looked almost childish against the white silk. A secret tenderness hidden where only Adrian would ever see it. Noah had protected him that way. Quietly. Carefully. Without trapping him. No, Adrian said. Haldan blinked. Your Majesty? Adrian placed the glove on the table between them. It looked absurdly small beside the maps and seals. No one will drag Noah Ellis back to this palace. Victoria's eyes lifted to him. Mason went very still. Haldan's concern hardened. If you allow him to remain outside royal protection, the opposition will use him. One minister slid the second newspaper proof closer, as if ink could frighten Adrian back into obedience. Adrian did not look at it again. Adrian leaned forward, both palms flat on the table. His voice stayed low. That made it stronger. Then I will go to him before they do. Impossible, Haldan said at once. You cannot leave the capital hours after securing the throne. Adrian looked at the crown reflected in the polished wood. Gold, perfect, cold. He remembered Noah's question in the library, spoken with tears he had tried to hide. If I disappeared tomorrow, would you look for me as your Omega, or as your mistake? Adrian had not answered then. He answered now, too late and in front of everyone. I am not going as a king. Slowly, he lifted the crown from his head. The room seemed to lose sound around the movement. He set it on the council table, beside the mended glove and the map to Greyhaven. I am going as the man who should have chosen him when he was still here. No one spoke. Outside the windows, the celebration had died into uneasy silence. Adrian turned to Mason. Saddle 2 horses. No royal banners. Mason bowed once, sharp and loyal. Victoria stepped aside to let him pass, then looked at Adrian with something like sorrow and respect. Halden's voice followed him to the door. If you walk out now, you may return to find the crown no longer waiting. Adrian paused with his hand on the frame. For the first time all night, the answer did not hurt. Then it will know how Noah felt. And behind him, on the council table, the crown sat alone beside a glove marked with a tiny blue star. The palace did not become quieter after Adrian left. It became honest. Without the crown at the head of the council table, every whisper seemed louder, every polished shoe against the marble sounded like a question no one wanted to answer. Lady Victoria remained in the war room long after the ministers scattered to protect their own names. She stood before the abandoned crown and looked at the glove beside it, at the tiny blue star stitched where no crowd would ever see. He loved him, she said softly. Lord Halden, still pale with anger, answered too quickly. The king was distracted. Victoria looked at him then, and for the first time that night, her perfect court mask cracked. No. He was human. You trained that out of him and called it leadership. Halden had no reply. Outside, the city waited for a balcony appearance that never came. Inside the eastern wing, Mrs. Clara returned to Noah's room with a lamp in one hand and grief in the other. She did not cry loudly. People who had served palaces for 40 years learned how to fold sorrow small. She straightened the already straight blanket, touched the chipped blue cup, and finally opened the drawer Noah had asked her to burn. Beneath the unsent letters was a small notebook bound with green thread. On the first page, Noah had written the dates of Adrian's headaches, the teas that worked, the meetings that left him unable to sleep, the names of councilmen who spoke kindly in public and cruelly in corners. Mrs. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and read until her hands shook. One line stopped her. His Majesty ate half the honey cake today. That is better than nothing. Another read, he looked at me when Lord Halden laughed. I think he wanted to say something. I wish wanting counted. Mrs. Clara pressed the notebook to her chest. Downstairs, Victoria entered the eastern wing without her aides. She found the old housekeeper in the room and did not ask permission to mourn. May I see it? She asked. Mrs. Clara hesitated, then handed her the notebook. Victoria read in silence. Page after page, there was no accusation, only the painful record of a young man trying to make a cold life softer for someone who rarely said thank you. Near the back, a folded note had been tucked between 2 pages. Victoria opened it carefully. It was not addressed to Adrian. It was addressed to her. Lady Victoria, if you marry him, please remind him to eat before council sessions. He forgets when he is worried. He dislikes being fussed over, but he tolerates soup if there is black pepper. He will pretend he does not need the blue blanket in winter. He does. Victoria's eyes filled before she could stop them. It was the tenderness that broke her, not the sadness. Noah had been leaving, and still he had written instructions for the woman expected to take his place. Not because he was weak. Because loving Adrian had become a habit of care he did not know how to abandon all at once. He thought I was his replacement, Victoria whispered. Mrs. Clara's voice was low and sharp with grief. Everyone made sure he did. Far east of the palace, Adrian rode through the dark with Mason at his side, no banners, no escort, no cheering crowd to mistake motion for victory. Snow gathered on his shoulders. The road to Greyhaven cut through pine woods and frozen fields, and every mile made the palace feel less like a fortress and more like a mistake. In his coat pocket, Adrian carried Noah's letter, still unread. He had read maps, laws, treaties, death notices, surrender terms. But he could not read the page that might tell him goodbye. Near dawn, they reached the overlook above the harbor. Greyhaven lay below them, gray and blue under a pale winter sky. Fishing boats rocked against the docks. Smoke rose from small chimneys. A ferry horn called across the water, low and mournful. Mason reined in beside him. "Your Majesty." Adrian did not correct the title. Not yet. His eyes were fixed on the dockside tea stand where a clerk was setting out paper cups for morning passengers. 2 cups sat on the counter, steam lifting from both, though only one person stood there to claim them. For one impossible second, Adrian thought it was Noah. Then the figure turned, and it was only a stranger in a brown coat. The hope disappeared so fast it left him hollow. Adrian finally unfolded the letter with numb fingers. The first line was simple enough to ruin him. "I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I finally understood that your crown would keep asking me to disappear, and one day, you would let it." Adrian read the rest of the letter, while the harbor woke around him. Wagons creaked over wet boards. A gull cried from the roof of the ferry office. Someone laughed too loudly near the bait shop, and the sound felt almost impossible, as if the world had forgotten it was supposed to be ending. Noah's words did not beg to be understood. That was what made them unbearable. He wrote about the council with painful clarity, about the whispers that followed him through the palace, about how every kindness Adrian hid became another reason Noah believed he was something shameful. Then, near the end, the writing grew less steady. "I know you were trying to protect me. I saw Mason outside the south corridor. I saw the rude footman transferred. I saw the books appear on my desk after I mentioned missing my mother's stories. I saw more than you thought I did. But hidden protection still feels like public loneliness." Adrian had to lower the page. Mason looked toward the ferry office, giving him the mercy of not watching. For a long moment, Adrian listened to the small, ordinary sounds of Greyhaven and understood why Noah's mother had wanted the sea. Nobody bowed to the tide. Nobody called the wind disloyal for leaving. The final lines waited at the bottom of the page. "Please do not turn me into a scandal to solve. Do not send guards to collect me like something misplaced. If there was ever a part of you that cared for me beyond duty, let me become someone who does not have to wait outside a closed door." Adrian folded the letter with both hands. He had come to Greyhaven ready to search every pier, question every captain, buy every ticket, follow every ship. He had imagined finding Noah before the opposition houses did, imagined standing between him and the world at last. But Noah had not asked to be found. He had asked to be free. That was a harder command than any council order. Mason spoke carefully. "There is still time to trace the ferry." Adrian looked at the water. Far out, beyond the line where morning fog blurred into silver, a ferry moved toward open sea. It might have been Noah's. It might not. For once, Adrian did not demand the world give him certainty. "No," he said. The word hurt, but it did not break him. "Send word to every port under my seal. Noah Ellis is not to be detained. Not questioned. Not followed. If anyone harms his name, they answer to me. If he asks for help, he receives it. If he asks for privacy, he receives that too." Mason bowed his head. "And the council?" Adrian slid the letter into his coat, close to his heart. "They wanted proof that I could choose the crown over him." He looked back toward the road, where the palace waited 30 miles away with its polished halls and empty room. "They will learn I can choose the crown differently." Months later, the Eastern Chamber remained untouched. Adrian returned the key to the desk, placed the paper crown beneath a glass case, and kept the blue cup by the window with fresh tea every morning until it cooled. People called it eccentric. Mrs. Clara called it penance. Victoria, who never became queen, called it honesty. Mason found him there one morning before sunrise, standing beside the window while the tea still steamed. "Do you think he will come back?" Mason asked carefully. Adrian watched the pale light touch the empty chair. He did not answer right away. Once, he would have said kings did not wait. Now he knew waiting could be the only honest thing left. "No," Adrian said at last. That is why I keep it warm. Mason said nothing after that. He only stepped back and closed the door softly, leaving the king alone with the cup Noah would never be ordered to drink. And somewhere far from Eldoria, in a seaside town with no royal banners, Noah opened a small tea shop with green curtains and mismatched chairs. He used his mother's name on the sign. Some mornings, when the fog came in low, he poured 2 cups out of old habit. Then he drank one, let the other cool, and did not apologize for leaving it untouched. One winter afternoon, a package arrived with no crest, no command, and no request to return. Inside was the mended white glove, folded around a single blue star cut from silk, and a note written in Adrian's hand. You were never my weakness. You were the part of me that still knew how to be kind. Noah stood behind the counter for a long time. Then he placed the note in a drawer beside his mother's recipes, wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, and went back to serving tea. Outside, the sea kept moving. Inside, Noah kept breathing. And in a palace far away, a king finally learned that love was not proven by how tightly he could hold on, but by whether he could let the person he loved become whole without him.